When Washington doubled down on the idea that America could stand on its own without Canadian timber, it was framed as a bold show of strength. But what if that policy intended to protect American industry quietly became a tax on the American dream itself? This analysis will dissect how that protectionist instinct collided with economic reality, triggering a cascade of unintended consequences that ultimately weakened the very nation it was meant to protect. To grasp how this happened, we have to start with the numbers, and here's where the math becomes impossible to ignore. For the last 50 years, the United States has had a permanent structural gap in its own lumber supply. According to the U.S. International Trade Commission and fast markets, imports have consistently accounted for 25 to 33% of all U.S. consumption. And of that critical import supply, Canada provides nearly 80%. This isn't a matter of political choice. It's a foundational reality of the entire U.S. housing market. So when you place a tariff on the one partner you structurally cannot replace, it doesn't function as leverage. It becomes a quiet, unavoidable tax passed directly on to the American home buyer. And this tax didn't just appear on a customs form at the border. It functioned as a silent construction tax that was passed directly down the supply chain, from the importer to the distributor to the builder, and finally landing squarely on the American home buyer. Here's where the math becomes impossible to ignore. Lumber isn't an optional decorative finish. It is foundational. It's the skeleton of homes, the framework of entire neighborhoods. So when the price of a foundational material goes up, that cost isn't just added, it's multiplied at every stage of the building process. It becomes a silent, structural inflation embedded into the very cost of shelter. This wasn't a minor increase, a rounding error on a project budget. According to the National Association of Home Builders 2025 analysis, these tariff actions added an average of $10,900 to the cost of a typical new single-family home. That figure is the concrete translation of policy into personal cost. It represents the line between a project being greenlit or shelved, between a family qualifying for a mortgage or being priced out of the market entirely. This wasn't just a spreadsheet exercise. In states like Texas, Florida, and Ohio, builders found themselves trapped. They had signed contracts based on one set of materials costs, only to watch those costs spiral upwards faster than they could possibly adjust their pricing. This led to a cascade of real-world economic disruption, project delays, frantic redesigns to use less wood, and in many cases, outright cancellations. Now, the textbook logic of protectionism suggests a simple answer to all this. Higher prices should incentivize domestic producers to ramp up, fill the gap, and eventually bring prices back down. That is the theory. But what happens when the very engine you're expecting to roar to life has fundamental structural problems? The core assumption was that American mills could and would simply step in to meet demand. The deeper reality of the U.S. lumber industry, however, reveals a very different story. That deeper reality is where the entire logic of the tariff collapses. The foundational assumption was that American mills could simply flip a switch and fill the void. This expectation crashed against the hard physics of industrial capacity. First, the U.S. lumber industry was already running near its structural limits, not in terms of market demand, but in terms of what its existing infrastructure could physically produce. A 2005 analysis from the National Association of Home Builders and Fast Markets revealed that in the first quarter of that year, U.S. sawmill capacity utilization was a mere 64%, a figure that had actually been declining since 2017. The tariffs did not and could not trigger a production surge because the capacity simply wasn't there to be surged. Here's where the math becomes impossible to ignore. A tariff wall can be erected overnight. An industrial base, however, takes decades to build. The same analysis calculated the scale of this challenge. To replace the volume of Canadian imports, the U.S. would need to build 75 new modern sawmills. This represents a capital investment exceeding the total of the last 15 years and would require over a decade to complete. The policy was sending a price signal that the industry was structurally incapable of responding to. This leads to the disconnect between policy intent and industrial reality. The expected boom in American forestry jobs never materialized because protectionism cannot magically fix aging equipment, overcome persistent labor shortages, or bypass regulatory hurdles. A tariff is a market signal. It is not a solution for a decades-long industrial capacity problem. The engine you were counting on had no fuel, so the policy failed to achieve its stated domestic goal. It protected an industry that couldn't expand, and it taxed an economy that desperately needed the supply. But to focus only on this domestic failure is to miss the true, deeply ironic outcome of this entire story. Because while the tariff was designed to punish a competitor, it inadvertently forged it into something much more formidable. The real strategic consequence wasn't what happened inside the US, but how Canada was forced to adapt outside of it. And that adaptation wasn't a minor course correction. It was a fundamental restructuring of an entire national industry triggered by an inescapable financial reality. Since 2017, Canadian producers have been forced to pay approximately $7.7 billion in cumulative duties. That isn't just a tax. It's a powerful, unambiguous signal from your largest customer that the business relationship has fundamentally changed. When your primary market becomes systematically hostile, you have two choices. You can wither or you can evolve. To grasp the scale of this evolution, we need to look at the before picture. Historically, the Canadian lumber industry was overwhelmingly dependent on the United States, sending nearly 90% of its exports south of the border. This was a structural vulnerability of massive proportions. The tariffs, intended to exploit this weakness, instead acted as the catalyst to solve it. Forced out of their comfort zone, Canadian producers accelerated a pivot that was long overdue. They began an aggressive campaign of market diversification. Suddenly, containers of Canadian spruce, pine, and fir were finding new, welcoming ports in Asia and Europe. Japan, for example, a market with exacting quality standards, saw its imports of Canadian lumber increase by as much as 25% during this period. Major firms like West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor used the period of globally high lumber prices, a period the tariffs themselves helped create, to reinvest those profits into technology and expand their international footprint. But this wasn't just about finding new customers for the same old 2x4s. The deeper, more strategic pivot was in the product itself. This is where the concept of lumber as green steel began to gain serious traction. This isn't just a marketing slogan. It represents a fundamental shift up the value chain. Canada began to aggressively brand and develop high-value, engineered wood products like mass timber. Think of giant laminated beams and panels that can form the skeletons of skyscrapers, replacing concrete and steel. This pivot perfectly aligned Canada with the growing global demand for low-carbon, sustainable construction. The policy designed to punish a competitor for producing a simple commodity inadvertently forced that competitor to become a leading supplier of a sophisticated, high-demand product of the future. The entire strategic position of the industry was upgraded. This pattern, where a policy creates the very outcome it was designed to prevent, is a fascinating study in unintended consequences. It's certainly not unique to lumber. What other industries or international situations have you seen where a major strategic move completely backfired on its creator? I'd be interested to read your examples in the comments. So here's the final impossible piece of the puzzle. These tariffs were often justified, implicitly or explicitly, in the name of national security, of ensuring American self-sufficiency. Yet the result was a Canada less dependent on the US, and a US more vulnerable to the very supply shocks it sought to avoid. Which leads to the critical question we have to tackle next. How could a policy designed to make America more secure end up systematically undermining that very goal? The answer to that question lies in the official justification itself, a powerful policy tool known as Section 232. This entire strategy was sold to the public as a matter of vital national security, a way to ensure American self-sufficiency in critical materials. But in reality, the policy achieved the precise opposite of its stated goal. Here's how the logic collapsed under its own weight. The key exhibit is the March 2025 White House executive order that triggered the tariffs. On one hand, it invokes Section 2132, framing Canadian lumber imports as a threat that compromised domestic production. On the other hand, the very same order explicitly acknowledged wood's essential role in both military and civilian construction. The policy was designed to protect an essential material by making that same material more expensive. The internal contradiction was there from day one. This wasn't just a philosophical problem. It created immediate, measurable damage on the ground. A September 2025 analysis from the National Association of Home Builders confirmed that the tariffs directly and predictably raised housing costs for Americans. And here's where the strategic miscalculation becomes impossible to ignore. This was all happening while U.S. sawmills, the very industry the policy was meant to protect, were operating at only 64% capacity. It was a perfect storm of self-inflicted harm. A protectionist wall was built, but there was no one on the other side with the capacity to actually fill the void. When economists ran the numbers, the outcome was stark. They estimated the net negative impact on U.S. consumer welfare was around $1.5 billion, a cost that far exceeded any marginal gains for domestic producers. This reveals the core strategic blunder. Protectionist theory collided with supply chain reality. The stated goal was to make America stronger. The actual outcome was to amplify a known vulnerability by increasing the cost of a critical input, all for an industry that, as we've established, was structurally unable to meet the nation's demand, when judged not by our standards, but by the policy's own objective of enhancing national security. It was an unambiguous failure. It didn't strengthen America's resilience. It put a price on it. And this miscalculation created consequences that will echo for years, long after these specific tariffs are gone. The most significant damage isn't measured in the short-term economic loss, but in the quiet erosion of long-term strategic leverage. The entire US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement is up for review in 2026, and this time America will be negotiating with a partner that it has inadvertently taught a painful but incredibly valuable lesson: how to live and even thrive without them. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most critical consequence. The lesson Canada learned isn't just an abstract concept, it's being etched into the physical landscape with new infrastructure and into global ledgers with new trade agreements. As Canada actively builds new trade routes and deepwater port capacity directed away from the United States, America's ability to use lumber as a bargaining chip simply dissolves. This isn't speculative. Look at the numbers. Following the tariff escalations, British Columbia's softwood lumber exports to key segments in China rose sharply by 55%. And while rebuilding market share after recent global downturns takes time, the critical point is this: the government-supported pivot towards Asia, Europe, and the Middle East represents a permanent strategic realignment, not a temporary market fluctuation. This is where the math of geopolitics becomes impossible to ignore. A short-term policy designed to protect a domestic industry has permanently reshaped the long-term strategic landscape. Today's tariffs created tomorrow's leverage for Canada. Think about what this means for the mandatory review of the entire US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement in 2026. For decades, America's primary tool in any negotiation was the implicit power of access to its vast market. Because of these tariffs, Canada will enter those negotiations with proven, durable, and profitable alternatives. Its economic dependency has been systemically reduced, not by its own grand design, but as a direct, rational response to American policy. The power dynamic at the table has fundamentally changed. The deepest reality is this: the United States has deliberately weakened the resilience of its own continental supply chain. It has spent years teaching its most critical, reliable supplier that dependency is a liability. So the next time a true supply crisis hits, a pandemic, a natural disaster, a geopolitical shock, and America needs to rapidly secure resources from a trusted partner, that North American interdependence will be priced at an even higher premium. The bill for this policy collision hasn't been paid. It's simply been deferred, waiting for the next emergency to come due. We've now followed this chain of consequences all the way through, from the initial policy to the economic fallout to the industrial adaptation, and now to the erosion of future leverage. It's time to step back and assemble these pieces into a single, coherent picture. So after tracing this long chain of consequences, how do we assemble all the pieces into a single, coherent picture? The clearest way to see the entire dynamic is through a simple logical framework. And, but, therefore. Let's start with the and. And the United States has a structural, non-negotiable need for Canadian lumber to build its homes. This isn't a preference. It is a mathematical reality baked into its domestic supply chain. Then comes the but. But the tariffs, designed to protect American industry, collided with this reality. They functioned as a hidden tax passed directly to American homebuyers, worsening the housing affordability crisis. The policy's core logic, that domestic mills could simply fill the gap, was proven false by hard physical capacity limits. And in the deepest irony, the tariffs acted as an involuntary catalyst, forcing Canada to aggressively diversify its markets and innovate into higher value products, ultimately making it a stronger, more resilient global competitor. Therefore, we are left with the final, unavoidable conclusion. The softwood lumber policy was a profound strategic miscalculation. In the name of national interest, it paradoxically weakened America's own supply chain security and systematically eroded its long-term leverage over a critical partner. It stands as a textbook case of how well-intentioned policy can generate deeply counterproductive outcomes when it ignores the complex, hidden interdependencies that define our world. This was never just a story about lumber. It's a story about the real costs that ripple out when policy collides with reality. If you value this kind of deep analysis that deconstructs the system shaping our world, ensure you subscribe for more.